If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you already know what noise music is, and are relatively knowledgeable about some of the bigger artists in the scene, and have at least some sort of understanding as to how this type of music can be enjoyed. I've noticed that most videos talking about noise music on YouTube are written from the perspective of a newcomer, someone who more or less just discovered the genre and wants to share their initial impressions of the world. And I'll admit I'm guilty of that exact thing, as you'll know if you watch my video on Japanoise from a few years ago. But since then I've become much more educated and involved in the noise scene, and I thought it'd be nice to make a video from this perspective of someone more deep in the weeds, so to speak. So this is not going to be a video about how Merzbow's Pulse Demon is actually strangely relaxing if you just get lost in the sound, or something like that. This is going to be an in-depth discussion on the non-auditory aspects of noise music, namely the visual aesthetics, themes, and physical packaging of noise releases. Let's start with the visuals. Noise as a coherent and focused genre arguably started around the late 70s and early 80s with Japanese artists such as Hichio Kaiden, Hanatarash, and of course Merzbow pioneering a sort of lo-fi, messy, distorted approach to free improvisation. And with this came the early visual elements of noise releases, which generally attempted to reflect the sound with equally low quality and usually unintelligible image collages. Merzbow once said in an interview that he tried to make his early tapes, give off the same feel as like cheap pornography VHS tapes, cementing noise music as a sort of low art right from the beginning, clearly distinguished from the more academic and intellectual approaches to abstract sound compositions going on in the avant-garde modern classical world. This is a very important distinction to make here, because noise as a genre is totally different from what artists like Stockhausen and Xenakis were doing back in the 60s, because instead of trying to be some sort of revolutionary new approach to music as a whole, with pages of academic theory backing up their recordings, noise artists generally just make noise for the hell of it. It's fun, rebellious, countercultural, and allows for complete freedom of expression. In this sense, noise music is very close in attitude to punk, and in many ways could be considered much more punk than punk rock itself. And this association manifested within the visual aesthetics of noise as well. From the earliest Merzbow tapes to modern-day noise labels like Hiroshima, New Forces, and Total Black, just to name a few, the most prominent visual aesthetic within noise is the heavily contrasted black and white Xerox of a photo or a ripped-up collage of photos, distorted beyond easy recognition. This art style takes clear influence from hardcore and crust-punk cover art, as well as early industrial music visuals. And that industrial connection is important because a lot of noise directly evolved from both the sonic and visual styles of industrial bands like SBK and Throbbing Gristle. These artists set a template for industrial music to be controversial and transgressive, using extreme themes of violence and sexual deviancy as a reaction against the more conservative and mainstream culture. Noise artists took these ideas and ran with them, taking these themes to their logical endpoints. From here I want to talk about power electronics, a genre that began to take shape in the early 80s, primarily in the UK, with bands like Whitehouse, Sutcliffe Juggins, and Ramla. Power electronics is not noise per se, but rather a more extreme form of industrial music, characterized by oppressive synthesizer drones, repetitive pulsating rhythms, and distorted shouted vocals. However, it does have a lot of overlap with the noise scene, and there are many artists that blend these two styles together quite seamlessly. Power electronics quickly made a name for itself due to the extremely controversial themes it embraced, with many artists imbuing their albums with fascist imagery and themes of sexual violence, and quite often writing albums either dedicated to or from the perspective of infamous serial killers. One of the more prominent examples of this is the Deathpile album GR, a concept album written from the perspective of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. So, why did this genre embrace themes like this? You could simply explain it by saying that extreme music should be based around extreme topics, but I think it goes a bit deeper than that. Just the sound of power electronics alone, when it's done right, is disgusting, ugly, terrifying, oppressive. Just hearing unrelenting sheets of scathing noise clashing with aggressive shouting should naturally conjure up some pretty extreme and dark imagery in your mind, so it only makes sense that artists would embrace these themes in their lyrics and album art. Additionally, power electronics works perfectly for portraying the perspective of horrible people like Gary Ridgway because it sounds so ugly and repulsive. Writing a soft folk song from the perspective of a serial killer may be a bit creepy in a sense, but it has a totally different impact than hearing those types of lyrics in a power electronic song. So instead of glorifying these horrible things, I would argue that power electronics instead viscerally demonstrates how disturbing and disgusting they are by matching them with these corrosive and ugly sounds. While power electronics has mostly stuck to this general range of thematic content, noise, more broadly, has been a bit less aesthetically consistent. While some noise embraces similar themes as power electronics, other noise artists cover topics ranging from obscure B-movie horror flicks to classical ballet and the related fascination with women's feet. Of course, I'm talking about the Rita here. The only real consistency among noise themes is an obsession with something outside of the mainstream, topics that no one making more normal commercial music would dare to or even think to touch. While there's plenty of noise that focuses obsessively on specific topics like these, I'd argue that the majority of noise releases don't really have any obvious theme to them, but rather just a vague, abstract sort of aesthetic. More often than not, there is no obvious meaning or point to the visuals and track titles surrounding noise albums. They just simply complement the equally abstract and seemingly meaningless sounds. Another interesting feature of noise visuals is that generally the labels, rather than the artists, are the ones who decide the artwork, or at least the general aesthetic presentation of the releases. This leads to a cohesive visual aesthetic for the label, but not necessarily for the artist. Examples of labels with consistent visual styles include Vienna Press with its pink and black Xerox covers, Trapdoor Tapes with its faded and grainy grayscale artwork, and Modern Decadence with its busy and messy collage style. This uniformity is usually due to the label owner creating their own art for all of the label's releases. And as a side note, as someone who has released a couple tapes on different noise labels before, I've discovered that most of these labels keep all the profits for their sales and simply give the artists a certain number of copies to keep and distribute for themselves. So if you're looking to release a tape on a noise label, don't go into it expecting to get a share of the income, just expect to get several artist copies. But the visual presentation of noise music often goes beyond simply the cover art. One of the most unique and fascinating aspects of noise culture is the absolutely insane packaging that goes into many noise releases. While the majority of noise albums are released in simple jewel-case cassettes or slipcase CDRs, a large portion of them are packaged in a much more creative and interesting way. Much more so than any other genre, noise has garnered a reputation for its often ridiculous and totally inconvenient handmade packaging. There's no real way to sum up this packaging aspect since everyone has their own unique approach to it, but some of the most entertaining examples I've come across include this split between Prurient and a sonic deterrent that's packaged in a sculpture made from bits of garbage, Mugwump Reformer mixes by Macronympha, which is packaged in a box wrapped in metal wire, and Reciprocating Motion by Deterge, which is a tape attached to a circular saw blade. Some examples of cool noise packaging that I personally own include this Dust Belt tape box that's hand-painted and includes these two sticks just kind of lying around there. This stem tape packaged in a vacuum bag, and this Purges tape, which is housed in this metal box with a pair of paintings. There are even some artists who have released literally unplayable albums, such as Aseptic Conditioning by Lather, which is a tape encased in 50 square feet of aluminum foil, and for my personal collection, this Emile Beaulieu record that's been spray painted and melted, so it's not really playable, and this split between Extended Thorax and Noise Stereo emission that I haven't even bothered to open yet because it's a floppy disk and I have no way of playing that. So I suppose it's not technically unplayable, but it's certainly absurdly inconvenient to play. And that, I think, is one of the main running themes throughout all of these weird noise packages: inconvenience. The music is pretty much as inaccessible and uncommercial as possible, so the general idea is that the packaging should reflect that kind of inconvenient uncommerciality. A general sense of absurdist DIY creativity is also seen in both the sound and the packaging. So that's about all I have to say on the subject of noise packaging and visual aesthetics. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope I gave you a more in-depth overview of these particular aspects of the noise scene. And if you want to learn more about anything I touched on in this video, just leave a comment and we can talk about it, because clearly I'm a total nerd for this sort of thing. So yeah, thanks for watching, and to borrow Hospital Productions' catchphrase, support the underground.